Princess Isabella adjusted her emerald green gown one final time as she stood in the wings of the magnificent Palladium Theater. The sound of laughter and applause echoed from the grand auditorium, where the annual royal variety performance was already well underway. Tonight marked her 5th year attending this beloved charity event, but something felt distinctly different this time. Her lady-in-waiting, Margaret, approached with a gentle smile. "Your Royal Highness, they're ready for you in 2 minutes." Isabella nodded, her fingers unconsciously moving to the delicate sapphire necklace at her throat, a piece that had belonged to her late mother-in-law, Queen Eleanor. The weight of it felt both comforting and significant tonight. She had chosen it specifically for this evening, though she hadn't yet told anyone why. "Margaret," she said softly, "has there been any word from Pemberton Hall?" "All is well, Your Highness. The children are settled for the evening. Prince Alexander finished his mathematics assignment, Princess Charlotte completed her art project, and little Prince Henry is fast asleep after hearing 3 bedtime stories from his nanny." A warmth spread through Isabella's chest at the mention of her 3 children. Alexander, at 12, was beginning to understand the weight of his future responsibilities. Charlotte, 10, possessed an artistic soul that reminded Isabella daily of the importance of nurturing creativity alongside duty. And Henry, barely 6, still believed the world was filled with endless adventures waiting just around every corner. The stage manager appeared, headset around his neck, clipboard in hand. "Your Royal Highness, we're ready for your entrance." Isabella took a deep breath, feeling the familiar transformation that occurred whenever she stepped into her public role. The private moments of doubt, the quiet concerns about balancing motherhood with royal obligations, the secret she had been carrying for weeks now, all of it tucked neatly away behind the serene smile that had graced countless magazine covers. She walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, the warm lights illuminating her path to the podium. The audience rose to their feet, a sea of evening gowns and formal wear stretching back into the ornate balconies of the historic theater. This was her element, yet tonight she felt more vulnerable than usual. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone, "welcome to this year's Royal Variety Performance, an evening that celebrates the incredible talent of performers from across our kingdom while supporting the Entertainment Artistes Benevolent Fund." As she spoke the familiar words, her mind wandered briefly to the conversation she had shared with her husband, Prince Edmund, just 3 days earlier. They had been walking through the gardens of Pemberton Hall, their country estate, when she had finally voiced the idea that had been growing in her heart for months. "I want to do something different this year," she had told him as they paused beside the ancient oak tree where they often brought the children to climb and play. "Something that shows them, shows everyone, that being royal doesn't mean being separate from the real struggles families face." Edmund had listened carefully, as he always did, his hand finding hers as they stood in the dappled afternoon sunlight. "What did you have in mind?" The memory faded as Isabella continued her opening remarks, introducing the first act of the evening, a group of young dancers from a community center in East London. As she watched them perform, their joy and energy filling the grand space, she thought about the plan she had been developing. It was ambitious, perhaps even risky by royal standards, but it felt necessary. The performance continued around her, act after act showcasing the diverse talents that made their kingdom's cultural landscape so rich. There were comedians who made her laugh until her sides ached, musicians who moved her to tears, and performers whose skills defied explanation. Each act reminded her of why she had fallen in love with this particular royal duty. During a brief intermission, Isabella retreated to the royal box where Edmund waited with several other members of the royal family. Her brother-in-law, Prince Charles, was deep in conversation with the evening's producer about the logistics of filming certain acts for later broadcast. Her sister-in-law, Princess Anne, was reviewing the program with evident interest in the youth orchestra scheduled for the second half. "How are you feeling?" Edmund asked quietly, leaning close enough that his words were meant for her alone. "Nervous," she admitted, a confession she rarely allowed herself to voice. "But also excited. I think tonight is the right time." He squeezed her hand gently. "The children will understand. They're stronger than we sometimes give them credit for." Isabella smiled at that. Her children had indeed shown remarkable resilience over the years, adapting to the unique challenges of growing up in the public eye while somehow maintaining the wonderful innocence that made them simply Alexander, Charlotte, and Henry. not just the future heirs to the throne. The second half of the performance began with a spectacular musical number that had the entire audience on their feet. Isabella found herself genuinely caught up in the moment, clapping and swaying with the music alongside everyone else. These were the moments that reminded her why public service felt like such a privilege, even when the weight of it sometimes felt overwhelming. As the evening drew toward its close, Isabella knew her moment was approaching. She had arranged with the producers to have a few minutes at the end of the show for what she had described simply as special remarks. The Royal Communications team had prepared for various possibilities, but she had been deliberately vague about her exact intentions. The final act concluded to thunderous applause, and Isabella made her way back to the podium. The theater fell into expectant silence as she stood before the microphone once again. This time, however, she had no prepared speech cards in her hands. "Before we conclude this wonderful evening," she began, "I wanted to share something personal with all of you, and through you, with families across our kingdom." She paused, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, knowing that her words were being broadcast live to millions more. In that moment, she thought of Alexander, Charlotte, and Henry, safely tucked away at Pemberton Hall, unaware that their mother was about to change something fundamental about how their family approached their public role. As many of you know, being a member of the royal family means living much of your life in the public eye. It's a responsibility we accept gladly, but it also presents unique challenges, especially when it comes to raising children. The audience remained perfectly still, sensing that they were witnessing something unscripted and significant. For years, Prince Edmund and I have worked to give our children as normal a childhood as possible while preparing them for their future roles. We've tried to shield them from too much public attention, to let them simply be children for as long as possible. Isabella's voice grew stronger as she continued, the nervousness transforming into conviction. But recently, I've come to realize that perhaps we've been approaching this the wrong way. Perhaps instead of protecting them from the realities of public service, we should be teaching them to embrace it in their own unique ways. She glanced toward the royal box where Edmund sat, his encouraging nod giving her the final push of confidence she needed. Which is why I'm excited to announce that beginning next month, we'll be launching a new initiative called Future Voices. This program will give young people, including our own children when they're ready, opportunities to champion causes they care about, to use their platforms, whatever size they may be, to make positive changes in our communities. The announcement hung in the air for a moment before the audience erupted in applause. Isabella felt a surge of relief mixed with excitement. She had done it. She had taken the first step toward the change she believed was necessary. As the applause died down, she added, "Our children don't know about this announcement yet. Prince Edmund and I decided that they should hear about it the same way everyone else does, because this isn't just about our family. It's about recognizing that young people have valuable perspectives and capabilities that shouldn't be dismissed simply because of their age." The evening concluded with the traditional singing of the national anthem, but Isabella barely heard the familiar words. Her mind was already racing ahead to the conversation she would have with Alexander, Charlotte, and Henry the next morning. How would they react? Would they be excited about the opportunity to become more involved in public service? Would they feel pressured or overwhelmed? As the royal family made their way through the traditional meet and greet with performers backstage, Isabella found herself engaged in numerous conversations about the announcement. The reactions were overwhelmingly positive, with many performers expressing admiration for the initiative and several offering to participate in various ways. A young magician who had dazzled the audience earlier in the evening approached her with particular enthusiasm. "Your Royal Highness, I think what you're doing is brilliant. I grew up in foster care, and I would have loved to have had a platform to talk about that experience when I was younger. Sometimes adults don't listen to young people, but maybe they'll listen if they know someone important is taking us seriously." His words resonated deeply with Isabella. This was exactly what she had hoped to achieve, creating space for young voices that might otherwise go unheard. The drive back to Pemberton Hall was quiet, both Isabella and Edmund lost in their own thoughts. The countryside rolled past in darkness, punctuated by the occasional light from farmhouses and small villages. This was the journey that always marked the transition from their public selves back to simply being parents and partners. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Isabella asked as they turned through the gates of their estate. I think we're doing the brave thing, Edmund replied, and sometimes that's the same as the right thing. As their car pulled up to the main entrance of Pemberton Hall, Isabella could see warm light glowing from the windows of the family quarters. Somewhere inside, their 3 children were sleeping peacefully, unaware that their lives were about to change in ways both subtle and significant. Isabella stepped out of the car and looked up at the star-filled sky, thinking about the future she was trying to create for Alexander, Charlotte, and Henry. A future where being royal didn't mean being separate from the world, but rather being more deeply connected to it. A future where their privileges came with the responsibility to amplify voices that needed to be heard. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as news of the announcement spread and questions arose about implementation, logistics, and the wisdom of involving royal children more directly in public service. But tonight, Isabella felt a sense of peace about the decision. She had followed her instincts as both a mother and a royal, and that felt like the best foundation for whatever came next. As she walked through the familiar halls of Pemberton Hall, past portraits of previous generations of royalty, Isabella reflected on how each generation had faced the challenge of evolving traditions while maintaining their essential meaning. Perhaps this was simply her generation's contribution to that ongoing evolution. The house was quiet except for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the main hall. Soon, she would check on each of her children, kissing their foreheads and adjusting their blankets as she had done every night for years. But first, she wanted to sit quietly in her private study and think about the words she would use tomorrow morning to explain to Alexander, Charlotte, and Henry that their childhood was about to expand in ways they had never imagined. The surprise she was keeping from them wasn't just about the new initiative. It was about her growing belief that they were ready for more responsibility than she had previously thought possible. Ready to begin the lifelong journey of learning how to use their unique positions to make the world a little bit better. Isabella smiled to herself as she climbed the stairs toward the family quarters. Tomorrow would be the beginning of a new chapter for all of them, and despite her earlier nerves, she couldn't wait to see how the story would unfold. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the breakfast room at Pemberton Hall, casting long shadows across the polished oak table where the royal family gathered for their daily meal together. It was a tradition Isabella and Edmund had maintained since their children were small. No matter how busy their schedules, breakfast was family time. Alexander sat reading a book about medieval history while absently eating his porridge. At 12, he had recently discovered a passion for understanding the long line of monarchs who had come before him, approaching the subject with the serious intensity he brought to everything. Charlotte was sketching in her ever-present art pad, occasionally looking up to observe the play of light across her mother's face. Little Henry was building a fortress out of his toast, complete with jam-filled moats. Isabella watched her children with a mixture of love and nervous anticipation. In just a few minutes, she would share news that would change their understanding of their roles and responsibilities. She had barely slept the night before, running through various ways to explain the decision she and Edmund had made. "Children," she began gently, setting down her teacup with a soft clink against the saucer. "Your father and I have something important to discuss with you." Alexander immediately closed his book and gave his mother his full attention. Charlotte looked up from her drawing, sensing the serious tone. Henry continued with his toast fortress but tilted his head to listen. "Last night at the Royal Variety performance, I made an announcement about our family that I wanted you to hear from me personally," Isabella continued. "I announced a new initiative called Future Voices, which will give young people opportunities to speak about causes they care deeply about." She paused, studying their faces. Alexander's expression was thoughtful, Charlotte looked curious, and Henry seemed to be waiting for more information about what this meant for him specifically. "The reason I'm telling you this is because, when you feel ready, you'll have the opportunity to participate in this program. Not because you have to, but because you might want to. Because you each have unique perspectives and caring hearts that could help other people." Charlotte was the first to speak. "Does this mean we'll be doing more royal duties?" "Not exactly royal duties as you might think of them," Edmund interjected, moving to sit beside his daughter. "More like having a chance to talk about things that matter to you, to help raise awareness about causes you believe in." Alexander set his book aside completely. "What kinds of causes?" Isabella felt her heart warm at the genuine interest in her eldest son's voice. That would be entirely up to each of you. For example, Charlotte, you're always talking about how art programs in schools don't get enough funding. If you wanted to, you could visit schools and talk about why art education is important. You could meet with artists who work with young people. Charlotte's eyes widened with interest. Really, I could do that. When you're ready, Isabella assured her. This isn't about pushing you into anything before you're comfortable. It's about recognizing that you're growing up and might want to start using your voices for good. Henry raised his hand as if he were in school. What about me? I'm only 6. Isabella laughed, reaching over to ruffle his sandy hair. You're still quite young, sweetheart. But when you're older, if there's something you care about, you could talk about that too. Maybe something to do with animals or sports or whatever interests you then. Can I talk about horses? Henry asked excitedly. I want everyone to know that horses are the best animals and they should be treated really well. That could definitely be something you might talk about when you're older, Edmund said with a smile. Animal welfare is very important. Alexander had been quietly processing the information. Now he looked directly at his mother. Why didn't you tell us about this before you announced it? It was a perceptive question, and Isabella had expected it from her thoughtful eldest child. Because I wanted other families to know that we made this decision together, as a family, just like they might make important decisions. I didn't want it to seem like this was something being imposed on you from above. Also, she added, I wanted you to hear about it and have time to think about whether it's something you might want to do, without feeling pressured by having been part of the announcement. Charlotte had returned to her sketching but was drawing something new now, what appeared to be a group of children of various ages standing together. Will other kids be doing this too? Not just royal kids. Absolutely, Isabella said. In fact, you would be working alongside young people from all backgrounds. That's rather the point, to show that everyone's voice matters, regardless of who their parents are or where they come from. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their private secretary, James, who knocked gently before entering with a tablet in his hand. I'm sorry to disturb breakfast, Your Royal Highnesses, but the reaction to last night's announcement has been quite extraordinary. The communications team thought you might like to see some of the responses. Isabella accepted the tablet and began scrolling through news articles, social media posts, and official statements from various organizations. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with many people praising the initiative as a progressive step forward for the royal family. Look at this, she said, reading aloud from one article. Child welfare advocate Dr. Sarah Mitchell says, this initiative recognizes something many of us have been saying for years, that young people have valuable insights and shouldn't be sidelined from important conversations just because of their age. By including her own children in this program, Princess Isabella is demonstrating that she believes in equality of voice, not just equality of opportunity. Alexander leaned forward. Are people happy about it? It seems so, Isabella replied, continuing to scroll. Here's a statement from the head of the Children's Society saying they're excited to work with future voices. And this article quotes several teenagers who say they're interested in applying to participate. Charlotte looked up from her drawing again. How many kids will be in the program? We're still working out the details, Edmund explained. But probably around 20 or 30 young people to start with, ranging in age from about 10 to 18. The idea is to have small groups so everyone gets proper support and training. Training? Alexander asked. Yes, Isabella said. Public speaking can be challenging, especially when you're talking about serious topics. And there are skills involved in working with media, understanding how to communicate effectively with different audiences. No one would be expected to just figure it out on their own. Henry had finished his toast fortress and was now giving it his full attention, making tiny sound effects as imaginary knights defended the walls. But he was still listening, as evidenced by his sudden question. Will there be photographers? It was such a practical question from such a young child that both parents smiled. Henry had grown up with photographers as a constant presence in his life, and his matter-of-fact acceptance of them was both touching and concerning. Sometimes, Isabella answered honestly, just like with other royal engagements, but the focus would be on the message you're sharing, not just getting pictures. That's good, Henry said seriously. I don't want people to forget about the horses just because they're looking at me. The rest of breakfast passed with more questions from the children and careful, thoughtful answers from their parents. Isabella was struck by how naturally her children seemed to be processing this new possibility. There was no resistance, no complaints about increased responsibility. Instead, there was curiosity and, increasingly, enthusiasm. After the children had been excused to begin their morning lessons with their tutors, Isabella and Edmund remained at the breakfast table, enjoying a few moments of quiet conversation. "That went better than I expected," Isabella admitted. "They're remarkable children," Edmund replied. "But then, they've been preparing for some version of this their entire lives, even if they didn't know it." Alexander seemed particularly thoughtful about it all. "He's been asking more questions lately about what his future role will actually involve," Edmund said. "I think he's ready for more responsibility, even if we're not entirely ready to give it to him." Isabella nodded. As much as she wanted to preserve her children's innocence for as long as possible, she also recognized that sheltering them completely from their future responsibilities might not be the kindest approach. Better to introduce them gradually to the realities of public service while they were still young enough to shape those responsibilities around their own interests and passions. "What about Charlotte?" She seemed excited about the art education angle. "She's been passionate about that for months," Edmund observed. "Remember how upset she was when her friend Emma mentioned that their local primary school had to cut their art teacher's hours due to budget constraints? Charlotte spent the entire car ride home talking about how unfair it was that children might not get to experience the joy she finds in creating." Isabella remembered that conversation well. Charlotte had been nearly in tears over the injustice of it, and had spent the following week creating a series of paintings that she had wanted to donate to Emma's school, so they remember that art is important. It had been one of those moments that highlighted both Charlotte's generous heart and her growing awareness of inequality in the world around her. "I think we should start slowly," Isabella mused. "Maybe arrange for each of them to visit one organization or school related to their interests. Nothing formal, nothing with media coverage. Just a chance for them to see what's out there and how they might want to contribute." "That sounds wise," Edmund agreed. "Let them develop their own understanding of the issues before asking them to speak publicly about anything." Their conversation was interrupted by Charlotte herself, who appeared in the doorway looking slightly breathless with excitement. "Mummy, I was thinking during lessons, could I write a letter to that school Emma told me about, the one that had to cut their art teacher's hours? I could ask them about their art program and maybe find out what they need." Isabella felt a surge of pride at her daughter's initiative. "That's a wonderful idea, darling. Would you like help with the letter?" "I think I can do it myself," Charlotte said confidently, "but maybe you could read it before I send it." "Of course." Charlotte started to leave, then turned back. "Mummy, how will we know if we're doing the Future Voices thing right? How will we know if we're really helping?" It was such a mature question that Isabella felt momentarily overwhelmed by her daughter's wisdom. "I think we'll know we're doing it right if the people we're trying to help tell us that our efforts are making a difference, and if we keep learning and growing from every experience." "Okay," Charlotte said, satisfied with this answer. "I'm going to start working on that letter right now." After Charlotte disappeared again, Isabella turned to Edmund with a mix of amazement and slight concern. "Are we asking too much of them? Charlotte's only 10, but she's already thinking like a young adult about these issues." "I don't think we're asking too much," Edmund replied thoughtfully. "I think we're finally asking the right things. We've raised them to be compassionate and thoughtful. Now we're giving them appropriate ways to act on those qualities." "I suppose you're right," Isabella said. "I just want to make sure we're not rushing them into anything they're not ready for." "We'll take it step by step," Edmund assured her. "And we'll check in with them constantly. If any of them ever feel overwhelmed or want to step back, that has to be okay too." Isabella nodded, feeling reassured by her husband's practical approach. One of the things she loved most about Edmund was his ability to balance idealism with realism, dreams with practical considerations. The rest of the morning passed quickly, with various meetings and phone calls related to the announcement the night before. Isabella found herself energized by the positive response and the concrete suggestions coming in from various charitable organizations about potential collaborations. At lunch, the family gathered again, and the children's enthusiasm for the Future Voices initiative had only grown throughout the morning. I've been thinking about the environmental club at my school, Alexander announced as he took his seat. They do really good work, but hardly anyone knows about it. Maybe I could help them get more attention for their projects. That sounds like a perfect fit, Isabella said. Environmental conservation is certainly an important cause. And I finished my letter to Emma's school, Charlotte added proudly. I asked them lots of questions about their art program and what kinds of supplies they need most. Henry, not to be outdone by his older siblings, piped up with his own contribution. I told my riding instructor about the horse thing, and she said there's a place where they help horses that were hurt. Maybe I could visit there when I'm older. Isabella looked around the table at her 3 children, each already beginning to identify causes they cared about, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The surprise she had been keeping from them had transformed into something even better than she had imagined, not just a new initiative, but a new way for their family to approach their role in the world. I'm very proud of all of you, she said simply. Not because of what you might do in the future, but because of how thoughtfully you're approaching these ideas right now. As lunch concluded, and the children returned to their afternoon lessons, Isabella reflected on how much had changed in just one day. The announcement that had seemed so daunting the night before now felt like the natural next step in their family's evolution. The surprise was no longer a secret, but the real adventure was just beginning. 3 weeks after the announcement, Isabella found herself standing in the art room of St. Margaret's Primary School in East London, watching her daughter Charlotte explain the importance of creative expression to a group of wide-eyed 8-year-olds. It was their first unofficial visit as part of the Future Voices initiative, and Isabella was amazed by how naturally Charlotte had taken to the role. Art isn't just about making pretty pictures, Charlotte was saying, holding up a watercolor painting one of the students had created. It's about showing how you feel and what you think about the world. This painting tells me that Sarah loves her garden and pays attention to how many different shades of green exist in nature. The young artist, Sarah, beamed with pride as her classmates gathered around to look more closely at her work. Isabella noticed how Charlotte's genuine enthusiasm was infectious, inspiring even the most reluctant students to participate in the conversation. Mrs. Peterson, the part-time art teacher whose reduced hours had originally sparked Charlotte's interest in art education funding, stood beside Isabella watching the interaction. "I've never seen them so engaged," she whispered. "Your daughter has a real gift for connecting with children." "She's always been passionate about art," Isabella replied quietly. "But this is the first time she's had the opportunity to share that passion with others in this way." The visit had been carefully planned as a learning experience rather than a formal royal engagement. No media had been invited, and the school had agreed to keep the visit private. The goal was simply for Charlotte to understand the challenges facing art education in schools while giving the students a chance to share their own creative work with an appreciative audience. Charlotte moved to another table where a boy named Marcus was working on a sculpture made from recycled materials. "Tell me about your creation, Marcus," she said, crouching down to his eye level. "It's a robot that cleans up the ocean," Marcus explained seriously. "My dad says there's lots of rubbish in the water that hurts the fish." "That's such an important message," Charlotte responded. "Art can help people understand problems like that, can't it? When you show someone your ocean-cleaning robot, they think about how to protect sea animals." Isabella watched this exchange with growing pride and a touch of concern. Charlotte was handling herself beautifully, but Isabella could see the weight of responsibility in her daughter's posture, the careful way she was choosing her words. It was both impressive and heartbreaking to witness her 10-year-old daughter already learning to balance genuine feeling with public representation. After spending an hour with the children, Charlotte and Isabella met with the school's headmaster, Mr. Davies, and Mrs. Peterson to discuss the challenges facing arts education in the school. The conversation was eye-opening in ways Isabella hadn't fully anticipated. "We know how important creative education is," Mr. Davies explained as they sat in his small office, walls covered with student artwork. "But when budgets are tight, arts programs are often the first to be reduced. Parents understand the necessity of mathematics and reading, but they don't always see the immediate practical value of painting or music." Charlotte leaned forward in her chair. "But art helps with other subjects too, doesn't it? When I paint, I learn about colors mixing together, which is like science. And when I look at historical paintings, I learn about what life was like in different times. Exactly right, Mrs. Peterson said with a smile. Art education supports learning across the curriculum, but it's difficult to communicate that to decision makers who are focused on test scores and measurable outcomes. What would help the most? Isabella asked. If resources weren't a constraint, what would make the biggest difference for your students? Mr. Davies and Mrs. Peterson exchanged glances before Mrs. Peterson spoke. Honestly, more time and more materials. I can only teach here 2 days a week now, which means some children go weeks between art lessons. And our supply budget has been cut so significantly that we often ask parents to provide basic materials like paper and paint. Charlotte looked thoughtful. What if there was a way to help other people understand how important art education is, not just parents, but the people who make decisions about school budgets? That would be wonderful, Mr. Davies said. But reaching those audiences is challenging for a school like ours. We don't have public relations departments or media connections. Isabella saw the moment when understanding clicked in Charlotte's eyes. This was the gap that future voices could potentially bridge, connecting passionate young advocates with the platforms needed to reach decision makers. After leaving St. Margaret's, Isabella and Charlotte sat together in their car as it made its way back towards central London. Charlotte was unusually quiet, staring out the window at the passing streetscape. "How are you feeling about the visit?" Isabella asked gently. "Sad and excited at the same time," Charlotte replied without looking away from the window. "Sad because Mrs. Peterson can't teach as much as she wants to, and because some of those children don't get to do art very often. But excited because I think I understand now what you meant about using our voices." "What do you mean?" Charlotte turned to face her mother. "Mrs. Peterson and Mr. Davies care so much about their students, and they know exactly what would help. But nobody important is listening to them. Maybe if I talked about it, more people would pay attention because I'm a princess. And then they might actually listen to what Mrs. Peterson has been trying to say all along." Isabella felt a complex mixture of pride and melancholy. Her daughter had grasped both the opportunity and the inequality inherent in their situation with startling clarity. "That's very insightful, darling. How do you feel about that responsibility?" Charlotte considered the question seriously. "A little scared, but also like it would be wrong not to try. If I can help Mrs. Peterson help her students, then shouldn't I?" They were interrupted by Isabella's phone ringing. It was Edmund, calling from his own visit with Alexander to an environmental conservation project in Surrey. "How did the school visit go?" he asked after Isabella had put the call on speaker. "Educational for both of us," Isabella replied. "Charlotte, tell Daddy what you learned." As Charlotte recounted the visit, Isabella listened to her daughter's thoughtful observations about the challenges facing arts education. In the background, she could hear Alexander's voice asking his father questions about water pollution monitoring. "Alexander wants to know if Charlotte would be interested in collaborating on something," Edmund said. "The environmental group he visited today mentioned that they use art and photography to help communicate scientific information to young people. He thought Charlotte might have ideas about that." Charlotte's eyes lit up. "Really, art can help with environmental education?" "Apparently so," Edmund continued. "They showed us some incredible posters and infographics created by teenagers to explain climate change. Alexander was quite impressed." "Could we visit them together sometime?" Charlotte asked. "Maybe I could learn about using art to teach people about protecting the environment." Isabella smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm. "I think that could definitely be arranged." Later that evening, after the children had gone to bed, Isabella and Edmund sat in their private sitting room at Pemberton Hall, sharing the details of their respective visits. Edmund described Alexander's serious engagement with the scientific aspects of environmental monitoring, while Isabella recounted Charlotte's natural ability to connect with the children at St. Margaret's. "They're both taking this so seriously," Edmund observed. "More seriously than I expected, to be honest." "I know," Isabella agreed. "Charlotte asked me in the car if it would be wrong not to use her voice to help when she has the ability to do so. It's quite a sophisticated understanding of responsibility for a 10-year-old. "Alexander said something similar," Edmund replied. "He told me that he's been thinking about how much environmental data exists that never reaches the people who could act on it, simply because scientists and policymakers speak different languages. Isabella curled up in her favorite armchair, tucking her feet under her. Are we doing the right thing? Sometimes I worry that we're asking them to grow up too fast. I've been thinking about that too, Edmund said. But watching Alexander today, seeing how engaged he became when he understood that his interest in environmental science could actually help solve problems, I think we're not asking them to grow up faster. We're just giving them more meaningful ways to express who they already are. Charlotte said something today that really struck me. She said she felt like it would be wrong not to try to help when she has the ability to do so. That's not a burden we've placed on her. That's her own sense of justice and compassion. Edmund nodded thoughtfully. And we're not sending them out alone. We're introducing them gradually to the complexities of public service while making sure they have support and guidance. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Charlotte appeared in her pajamas, holding her favorite stuffed elephant. I'm sorry to bother you, she said quietly, but I couldn't sleep. I keep thinking about Mrs. Peterson and her students. Isabella held out her arms, and Charlotte climbed into the chair with her mother. What specifically is keeping you awake, sweetheart? I keep thinking about what I could say that might help people understand why art education matters. And I'm worried that I won't say it right, or that people won't listen to me because I'm just a kid. Edmund moved to sit on the arm of Isabella's chair so he could be part of the conversation. Would it help to know that we don't expect you to have all the answers right away? Learning to speak effectively about issues you care about takes time and practice. And remember, Isabella added, you won't be doing this alone. There will be training and support, and you'll be working alongside other young people who care about similar issues. Plus, your father and I will help you every step of the way. Charlotte snuggled closer to her mother. Could I practice with you? Could I try explaining why art education is important and you could tell me if it makes sense? Of course, Isabella said. But not tonight. Tonight you should try to get some rest. We can practice tomorrow after you've had time to think about everything you learned today. Okay, Charlotte agreed. But Mummy, I'm glad we're doing the Future Voices thing. Even though it's a little scary, it feels important. After tucking Charlotte back into bed, Isabella returned to the sitting room where Edmund was reading through some of the applications they had received from young people interested in participating in the Future Voices initiative. Look at this one, he said, handing her a letter written in careful handwriting. It's from a 14-year-old girl who wants to speak about mental health support for teenagers. Her letter is incredibly articulate about the challenges young people face in accessing appropriate care. Isabella read the letter, impressed by the writer's maturity and clear passion for the subject. This is exactly what I hoped for young people who have real experience with these issues and want to create positive change. We're going to have some remarkable participants in this program, Edmund observed, and our children will have the opportunity to learn from and work alongside them. I think that might be one of the most valuable aspects of all this, Isabella replied. Not just that our children will develop their own voices, but that they'll learn to listen to and collaborate with other young people from very different backgrounds. She set down the application and looked at her husband. You know, when I first conceived of this initiative, I thought it was primarily about giving young people platforms to speak about issues they cared about. But I'm starting to realize it's equally about education, teaching them to research thoroughly, to listen carefully, to communicate effectively. Essential skills for anyone, but especially for our children given their futures, Edmund agreed. As they prepared for bed, Isabella reflected on how much had changed since the Royal Variety performance just 3 weeks earlier. What had begun as a single announcement had already started to transform how their family approached their public role. More than that, it was changing how their children understood their place in the world. Charlotte's question earlier, whether it would be wrong not to try to help when she had the ability to do so, suggested that the initiative was fostering exactly the kind of thoughtful engagement Isabella had hoped for. Not obligation born from duty, but responsibility arising from empathy and understanding. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they began the formal planning process for Future Voices, including the selection of participants and the development of training programs. But tonight, Isabella felt confident that they were moving in the right direction, guided by the wisdom and enthusiasm of their children and the young people who had already expressed interest in participating. The surprise announcement had become something much larger and more meaningful than she had originally envisioned. A genuine movement toward more inclusive and effective public service, led by the next generation. 2 months after launching Future Voices, Isabella stood in the grand ballroom of Pemberton Hall, which had been transformed into a training center for the program's first cohort of participants. 25 young people, ranging in age from 10 to 18, had been selected from hundreds of applications. They came from every corner of the kingdom, representing diverse backgrounds, experiences, and causes. Isabella watched as Charlotte worked alongside a 16-year-old named Jamie, who had been advocating for better mental health resources in schools. They were collaborating on a presentation about the connection between creative expression and emotional well-being, combining Charlotte's passion for art education with Jamie's expertise in mental health advocacy. I never thought about how art class might be the only place some students feel safe to express difficult emotions, Charlotte was saying, looking at notes Jamie had made from interviews with their classmates. And I never considered how cutting arts programs might eliminate one of the few outlets for students who are struggling emotionally, Jamie replied. This connection could be really powerful to share with school administrators. At another table, Alexander was deep in discussion with 3 older teenagers who were working on environmental justice issues. Isabella could hear fragments of their conversation about the intersection of environmental degradation and socioeconomic inequality, topics that were challenging even for many adults to navigate thoughtfully. The thing is, Alexander was saying, if we only talk about environmental protection in general terms, we miss how these problems affect different communities differently. The river pollution data I've been studying shows that low-income neighborhoods are disproportionately impacted. A 17-year-old named Marcus nodded approvingly. Exactly. That's why environmental activism has to include conversations about social justice. You can't solve one without addressing the other. Isabella felt a surge of pride watching her 12-year-old son engage with such complex ideas while holding his own in conversation with teenagers several years older. The training program had exceeded her expectations in terms of fostering meaningful collaboration across age groups. Dr. Sarah Chen, the educational consultant they had hired to develop the program curriculum, approached Isabella with a pleased expression. Your children are remarkable, Your Royal Highness. They're not just participating, they're helping to elevate the conversations happening around them. How so? Isabella asked, though she had her own observations. Charlotte has this wonderful ability to ask questions that help others clarify their thinking. Watch her with Jamie, she keeps asking, but why do you think that is? And what would that look like? In ways that push the discussion deeper. And Alexander brings a research-oriented approach that encourages others to support their passionate arguments with solid evidence. Isabella nodded, having noticed the same patterns. They're learning as much as they're contributing. That's the beauty of this peer learning model, Dr. Chen continued. The younger participants gain exposure to more sophisticated advocacy approaches, while the older ones develop mentoring skills and learn to communicate complex ideas more accessibly. The morning session concluded with each working group presenting their preliminary ideas to the full cohort. Isabella was impressed by the diversity of topics being addressed. Sustainable fashion advocacy by a 14-year-old who had researched textile industry working conditions. Digital literacy education for elderly residents by twins who had been teaching their grandparents to use technology. Accessibility awareness led by a 13-year-old wheelchair user who wanted to improve inclusion in recreational activities. During the lunch break, Isabella found herself in conversation with several of the participants' parents who had come to observe the training session. The mother of Aisha, a 15-year-old refugee advocacy presenter, expressed gratitude that surprised Isabella with its intensity. Mrs. Hassan, please call me Isabella during these informal moments, she said as they sat together in the garden behind the hall. Thank you, Your Royal Highness Isabella, Mrs. Hassan corrected herself with a smile. I wanted to tell you how much this program means to Aisha. She has such important experiences to share about refugee resettlement, but before Future Voices, she never imagined that adults would be interested in hearing her perspective. Her presentation this morning was incredibly powerful, Isabella replied sincerely. Her insights about the challenges refugee children face in schools were things I had never considered. She's been researching and preparing for weeks, Mrs. Hassan continued. But more than that, she's been growing in confidence. She told me yesterday that she's not just learning to speak about refugee issues, she's learning to speak about anything that matters to her. This conversation was interrupted by Charlotte, who approached with Jamie and two other participants in tow. "Mummy, could we ask you something about working with adults who might not want to listen to young people?" Isabella invited the group to sit down, curious about the question. "What specifically are you thinking about?" Jamie spoke first. "We've been practicing our presentations with each other, but we're worried about how to handle situations where adults dismiss our ideas just because we're young." "That's a really important question," Isabella acknowledged. "What strategies have you been considering?" "Research," Alexander said, joining the group with his environmental justice collaborators. "If we have really solid evidence to support our points, it's harder for adults to ignore us just because of our age." "That's definitely part of it," Isabella agreed. "What else?" Charlotte raised her hand tentatively. "Being really respectful but not backing down from our main points. Like acknowledging that adults have more experience while still insisting that our perspectives matter too." "That's very wise," Isabella said. "You can respect someone's experience without accepting that experience as the only valid viewpoint." A 16-year-old named David, who was working on criminal justice reform, added his own thoughts. "I think it also helps to find adults who are already working on these issues and want to include young voices. Then you're not trying to convince people who don't want to listen. You're working with people who understand that youth perspectives are valuable." The discussion continued for another 20 minutes, with the young participants sharing strategies and concerns, while Isabella offered guidance based on her own years of public advocacy. She was struck by how thoughtfully they were approaching not just their specific causes, but the broader challenges of effective advocacy. Later that afternoon, the participants split into smaller groups for media training with professional communications experts. Isabella watched through the window as Charlotte practiced being interviewed about arts education funding, learning to stay focused on her key messages while appearing natural and conversational. "The most important thing to remember," the trainer was saying, "is that you're having a conversation, not delivering a speech. If you forget a point you wanted to make, that's fine, just focus on connecting authentically with your interviewer and your audience." Charlotte nodded seriously, then tried the interview simulation again. This time, her responses flowed more naturally, and her passion for the subject came through clearly without overwhelming her ability to communicate specific information. At another station, Alexander was learning about the different requirements for speaking to various audiences, how a presentation to environmental scientists might differ from one aimed at policymakers or community groups. "The science is the same," his trainer explained, "but the language you use and the aspects you emphasize should match what your audience cares about and can act on." Alexander practiced adapting his environmental justice presentation for different audiences, and Isabella could see him growing more sophisticated in his understanding of strategic communication. As the training day concluded, the participants gathered in a circle for reflection and feedback. Dr. Chen facilitated a discussion about what they had learned and what questions remained. "I realize I need to do more research about the historical context of refugee policy," Aisha said. "Understanding how we got to current policies will help me explain why changes are needed." "I want to practice talking to younger kids about mental health," Jamie added. "I think peer support could be really powerful, but I need to learn how to communicate about these topics in age-appropriate ways." When it was Charlotte's turn, she said, "I learned that art education connects to lots of other issues I hadn't thought about. Maybe I should find out more about how art programs relate to mental health and community building, not just individual creativity." Alexander's reflection focused on collaboration. "Working with older participants taught me that I don't have to have all the answers before I start advocating for something. Sometimes bringing good questions is just as valuable as having solutions." As families began to depart, Isabella found herself energized by the day's interactions. The program was fostering exactly the kind of thoughtful, collaborative approach to advocacy that she had envisioned. More importantly, it was helping young people develop confidence in their own voices while learning to work effectively with others. Edmund joined her as they watched the last participants leave. How are you feeling about how the program is developing? Better than I had hoped, Isabella replied honestly. Look at how Charlotte has grown in just these few weeks. She's not just more confident about speaking publicly, she's thinking more systematically about complex issues. And Alexander seems to be finding his own style of leadership, Edmund observed. He's naturally collaborative, but he's also learning to hold his ground when he has important information to contribute. They were interrupted by Henry, who had been observing parts of the training day with fascination. At 6, he was still too young to participate formally, but he had been absorbing everything with the intense interest he brought to new experiences. Mummy, when I'm older, will I get to do training like Charlotte and Alexander? If you want to, Isabella assured him. But remember, you still have several years to figure out what issues you care most about. I already know, Henry said with characteristic confidence. I want to help animals and teach people about taking care of them properly, and maybe help kids who don't have enough food because that's not fair either. Isabella smiled at her youngest son's earnest social consciousness. Those are both very important causes, Henry. We'll make sure you have opportunities to learn more about them as you grow up. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Isabella and Edmund sat in their study reviewing feedback forms from the day's training session. The responses were overwhelmingly positive, but more importantly, they showed evidence of real learning and growth. One parent wrote, "My daughter has always been passionate about environmental issues, but she struggled to communicate her concerns effectively. Today, I watched her learn to organize her thoughts and present them persuasively. More than that, I saw her gain confidence that her voice matters." Another noted, "The collaboration between different age groups has been incredible to observe. My son is learning from teenagers while also contributing his own unique perspective. He's developing leadership skills I didn't know he possessed." "We're going to need to expand the program," Edmund said after reading through several more responses. "The demand is clearly there, and the model seems to be working well." "I've been thinking about that too," Isabella replied. "But I want to make sure we maintain the quality and intimacy that makes it effective. Maybe regional programs rather than just making this one larger." "That could work. We could train facilitators to run similar programs in different parts of the kingdom, all following the same basic model, but adapted to local issues and needs." Isabella felt excited about the possibilities for expansion, but also protective of what they had created. The success of the pilot program lay partly in its small size and intensive support. Scaling up would require careful planning to preserve those essential elements. "Let's see how the rest of this cohort's training progresses," she decided, "and maybe start identifying potential regional partners who share our approach to youth development." As they prepared for bed, Isabella reflected on how far they had all come since that night at the Royal Variety performance. What had begun as an uncertain announcement about including young voices in public discourse had evolved into a comprehensive program that was genuinely empowering participants while fostering thoughtful approaches to advocacy. The surprise she had kept from her children had transformed into something much more significant, a model for how royal service could evolve to be more inclusive and effective while maintaining its commitment to positive social change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the participants began preparing for their first public presentations. But tonight Isabella felt deeply satisfied with the foundation they had built together. 6 months after the Future Voices launch, Isabella stood backstage at the Royal Festival Hall, watching Charlotte make final adjustments to the visual aids for her presentation about arts education funding. Tonight marked the program's first major public showcase, where participants would present their advocacy work to an audience that included government ministers, charity leaders, educators, and media representatives. "I'm nervous," Charlotte admitted, smoothing her blue dress and checking her notes one more time. "That's completely normal," Isabella assured her daughter. "Even after years of public speaking, I still feel nervous before important presentations. The nervousness shows that you care about doing well." Charlotte nodded, taking a deep breath. "Jamie helped me practice yesterday. She said the key is to remember that I'm not trying to convince everyone tonight. I'm just trying to help them understand why this matters." Isabella smiled at the wisdom in that advice. Jamie, the mental health advocate who had become one of Charlotte's closest collaborators in the program, had developed remarkable insight into effective advocacy strategies despite being only 16. That's exactly right, Isabella confirmed. You're sharing information and passion, not demanding immediate action from everyone in the audience. Alexander appeared beside them, looking remarkably composed for someone about to address several hundred adults about environmental justice. How are you feeling, Charlotte? Nervous but excited, Charlotte replied. You? The same, Alexander said with a grin. Dr. Chen reminded us that we've prepared thoroughly and we have important things to say. That helps. Isabella felt a surge of pride watching her children support each other. The Future Voices program had strengthened the bond between them while giving each space to develop their individual interests and advocacy styles. 5 minutes until places, called the stage manager. Isabella hugged both children. Remember, your father and I are incredibly proud of you both, regardless of how tonight goes. You've already accomplished something remarkable by participating in this program and learning so much about issues you care about. Thank you, Mummy, Charlotte said, squeezing her mother tightly. We'll do our best, Alexander added seriously. Isabella made her way to her seat in the front row beside Edmund, who was scrolling through the program with obvious pride. The evening would feature presentations from 12 of the Future Voices participants, including several who had emerged as particularly effective advocates during their months of training. How are they doing? Edmund asked as Isabella settled beside him. Nervous but ready, she replied. I think the training has prepared them well for this moment. The program began with Dr. Chen providing context about Future Voices and introducing the evening's format. Each participant would have 8 minutes to present their issue and advocacy goals, followed by a brief question-and-answer session. Aisha, the refugee advocate, spoke first, delivering a presentation about the educational challenges facing refugee children that was both deeply personal and thoroughly researched. She spoke with quiet authority about policy changes that could improve educational outcomes while sharing stories that helped the audience understand the human impact of current limitations. When my family arrived here 3 years ago, Aisha said, I spoke very little English and had gaps in my education due to interruptions in my schooling. The teacher who took extra time to help me understand not just the language but how to navigate the school system changed my entire trajectory. Every refugee child deserves that kind of support, but right now, whether they receive it depends entirely on luck. Isabella watched the audience's reaction to Aisha's presentation, noting how many were taking notes and how attentively they listened to her policy recommendations. The teenagers' combination of personal experience and policy knowledge was clearly compelling. Jamie's presentation about mental health resources in schools followed, and Isabella was struck by how much the 16-year-old had grown in confidence and sophistication since the early training sessions. Jamie spoke candidly about their own struggles with anxiety while presenting research about the prevalence of mental health challenges among young people and the inadequacy of current support systems. Schools often wait until students are in crisis before providing support, Jamie explained. But mental health, like physical health, benefits from preventive care and early intervention. We need counselors who have time to build relationships with students, not just respond to emergencies. When Charlotte's turn came, Isabella felt her heart rate increase with maternal nerves. But as soon as Charlotte began speaking, those concerns faded. Her daughter had found her natural presenting style warm, conversational, but clearly informed and passionate. I want to share something that happened during one of my visits to schools participating in our research, Charlotte began. I met a 7-year-old boy named Marcus who told me that art class was his favorite part of school because it was the only time he felt like he could do everything right. When I asked him what he meant, he said that in mathematics and reading there were always wrong answers, but in art, his ideas were just his ideas. Charlotte went on to explain her research findings about the connection between arts education and academic confidence, emotional development, and creative problem-solving skills. She presented data about funding cuts and their impact on student outcomes, but always returned to the human stories that illustrated why these statistics mattered. Arts education isn't a luxury addition to core subjects, Charlotte concluded. It's a fundamental part of helping children develop the creativity, confidence, and communication skills they'll need throughout their lives. When we cut arts programs, we're not just eliminating painting and music, we're limiting children's opportunities to discover their own voices. The audience's response to Charlotte's presentation was immediately positive, with several people approaching her afterward to discuss potential collaborations and support for her advocacy work. Alexander's environmental justice presentation demonstrated his natural inclination toward systematic analysis combined with genuine passion for equity and environmental protection. He had spent months researching the intersection of environmental degradation and socioeconomic inequality, and his presentation revealed both the depth of his preparation and his growing sophistication as a communicator. Environmental problems are not equally distributed, Alexander explained, displaying maps and data that illustrated his points. Communities with fewer economic resources are more likely to live near pollution sources and less likely to have access to green spaces and environmental protections. This means that environmental policy is also social justice policy. He went on to present specific policy recommendations while acknowledging the complexity of implementing change across multiple government departments and community organizations. Isabella was impressed by how he balanced idealism with practical understanding of systemic challenges. The evening continued with presentations from the other participants, each demonstrating the growth and learning that had occurred during their months in the program. David spoke about criminal justice reform with a focus on rehabilitation and education. The twins presented their work on digital literacy for elderly residents, complete with video testimonials from seniors who had learned to use technology to stay connected with family. Aisha's environmental sustainability advocate presented research about sustainable fashion that had led to partnerships with several clothing companies committed to improving their manufacturing practices. During the reception following the presentations, Isabella moved through the crowd listening to conversations between participants and audience members. The networking happening naturally was exactly what she had hoped to facilitate connections between passionate young advocates and adults with resources and platforms to support their work. She overheard Charlotte explaining her research methodology to a representative from the Department of Education, who was asking detailed questions about how arts education funding could be restructured to be more equitable across different types of schools. At another cluster, Alexander was discussing his environmental justice research with several MPs who seemed genuinely interested in incorporating his findings into upcoming policy discussions. "Your Royal Highness," said Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the director of a major educational charity, "I wanted to thank you for creating this program. We've been struggling with how to include authentic youth voices in our policy work. Tonight has shown us both why that's important and how it can be done effectively." "The participants deserve all the credit," Isabella replied. "We simply provided structure and support for work they were already passionate about doing." "But that structure matters enormously," Dr. Warren continued. "Too often, youth engagement efforts are tokenistic. We invite young people to speak, but don't give them the training and support they need to be effective. This program clearly takes a different approach." Isabella nodded, pleased that the distinction was being recognized. "We believe that if young people are going to participate in public discourse about issues they care about, they deserve the same quality of preparation and support that we provide to adult advocates." As the evening concluded, Isabella gathered with Edmund and the children for a brief family reflection before returning home. They sat in a quiet corner of the reception area, away from the continuing conversations and networking. "How are you all feeling about tonight?" Isabella asked. "Proud," Charlotte said immediately. "Not just of myself, but of everyone. We all worked really hard, and I think people understood what we were trying to say." "I feel like we proved something important," Alexander added thoughtfully. "That young people can contribute meaningfully to serious policy discussions if we're given appropriate support and preparation." "What did you think was the most important part of the evening?" Edmund asked. Charlotte considered the question. "I think it was seeing how interested adults were in our research and ideas, not just being polite, but actually asking detailed questions and talking about how to implement some of our suggestions." "For me," Alexander said, "it was realizing that we're not just learning to advocate for issues we care about. We're learning skills that will help us be better leaders and citizens throughout our lives, regardless of what specific causes we focus on in the future." Isabella felt deeply moved by her children's reflections. They had grasped not just the immediate goals of the Future Voices program, but its longer-term significance for their development as thoughtful, engaged public servants. "I'm incredibly proud of both of you," she said, "not just for your presentations tonight, but for how seriously you've approached this entire experience. You've learned to research thoroughly, listen carefully to different perspectives, and communicate effectively about complex issues." "What happens next?" Charlotte asked. "Do we keep working on the same issues, or do we get to explore new ones?" "That's largely up to you," Isabella replied. "The program is designed to evolve based on participants' interests and the impact you're able to achieve. Some of you may want to deepen your work on current issues, while others might be ready to take on new challenges." As they made their way home through the London evening, Isabella reflected on how much had changed since that night at the Royal Variety performance when she had announced Future Voices as a surprise initiative. What had begun as an idea about including young voices in public discourse had evolved into a comprehensive program that was genuinely empowering participants while demonstrating new models for effective advocacy and civic engagement. The surprise she had kept from her children had transformed into something much more significant than she had originally envisioned. It had become a vehicle for their growth as compassionate, informed, and effective advocates for positive change. More than that, it had shown them that their royal status could be a tool for amplifying important voices and facilitating meaningful conversations about societal challenges. Looking at Charlotte and Alexander as they discussed their experiences in the car, Isabella felt confident that Future Voices had achieved its most important goal, helping young people discover that they had valuable contributions to make and providing them with the skills and confidence to make those contributions effectively. The program would continue to evolve and expand, but its foundation had been firmly established. Young people across the kingdom now had a model for how to engage constructively with complex social issues while building the leadership skills they would need throughout their lives. As they arrived at Pemberton Hall, where Henry was waiting to hear all about the evening's presentations, Isabella smiled at the thought of how naturally this program had emerged from their family's commitment to service and their belief in the importance of listening to diverse perspectives. The surprise had become a lasting legacy, one that would continue to create opportunities for young voices to be heard and valued in conversations about creating positive change in their communities and beyond.